Welcome to RenMac Off Script, where we're able to discuss markets, economics, policy, history, and life. It is the 22nd of November, 2023. I'm Jeff DeGraff,
And I'm
and
Steve Pavlik.
look at that. You know what I'm thankful for, Steve?
That Neil's not here.
Yes, you are too, clearly.
I
It's my
can't think of
forum.
any thing that goes sort of counter to Thanksgiving tradition than going to Cancun, which I believe is where he is right now. Wasn't he in like the Middle East for the 4th of July too? I mean, there's
Yeah,
something about him in U.S. traditions, but
yeah, right, absolutely. But in Cancun, or at least the warmer islands, are definitely a tradition of his over Thanksgiving. I've done that before, but I found that it was windy. It was not it's not hurricane season any longer, but you tend to get a lot of wind down there. But it's a good place for him with a lot of wind, so I'm sure he'll be thriving. Well, as a reminder, let's go through our preamble here. All the charts that we reference are posted to our Twitter account at RenMac LLC and our LinkedIn page. And if you're listening and you want deeper insight, but you're not an institutional account and you can't imagine paying the absorbent amount that some people pay to listen to Steve, me, and Neil, then you should look at renmacaccess.com. That's RenMac Access with a dot and then a com after it. And it's really designed for RIAs and intelligent investors to give them the insights to some of the ideas that we're talking about here. Let's talk about, I know it's the election. I'm going to be thankful for in a year that the damn thing's done, regardless of who wins, frankly. So, there's something in math called the transitive laws or transitive properties. And basically what it means is that if A equals B and B equals C, then A must equal C. It makes a lot of sense. But at the same time, it's kind of getting twisted here in the polls. And I say that because, if you look at the national polls, it says that Trump is likely to beat Biden. It says that Haley is likely to beat Biden, and with a bigger margin, by the way. But from the Republican side of the ledger, Haley is likely to lose dramatically to Trump. So are those transitive properties kind of getting thrown out the window here, or is that just a difference between the national election and the Republican side?
I think it's more the latter. I mean, you just have two different electorates between the general election and a Republican primary that skews more towards the base and to the right, which I think, to your point, is Haley's problem. She's running a campaign that is geared more towards the general election, but it's going to be difficult for her to get through this Republican primary. She's gaining momentum, and you're seeing, some Wall Street donors start to, coalesce behind her. I just think it's too little, too late. Their track record so far hasn't been great. A lot of them had early spent money on DeSantis. I think there's still a possibility that DeSantis may overperform in Iowa, and then at that point, a lot of Haley supporters may gravitate towards him. But if he doesn't, we'll see. I mean, there's theoretically possible Haley could win New Hampshire, and then she should win South Carolina, given that she was a governor there. But if you don't see that, then I think that the polls are probably right that Trump's going to continue to pull away.
I think it might actually be easier to draft an NFL quarterback than it is trying to pick a presidential candidate. I mean,
Well,
it's
if you think about an incumbent as sort of a starter, maybe there's something to that. I mean, Trump is running in his mind as an incumbent, similar to Biden. And I think what's sort of interesting right now is you see to have both of them sort of deploying this basement strategy. Biden did it a lot in 2020, used the guise of COVID, kept the focus on Trump, and was able to successfully win. Now you have a situation where Trump's avoiding the limelight in many cases. He's not participating in the primary debates, just like Biden's not participating on the Democrat side. But by sort of staying relatively out of the news, Trump is keeping the focus on Biden. And it's sort of this weird dichotomy where you have Republicans and Trump benefiting every time the media is talking about Biden and his record, and vice versa. You have Democrats still believing that if they can switch it back to Trump, that they'll be victorious again in 2020. And David Axelrod keeps saying that's very risky. He said Hillary Clinton's team tried to do that in 2016. It didn't work out for him. And then you get into this whole third party threat. When Biden was the lone alternative to Trump and he prevailed in 2020, if you have more options beyond Biden, if there's not an affirmative case for Biden, and polls suggest that there's not, then people who don't like Trump have more options. I think that's sort of what Democrats are more worried about right now.
Yeah, it's amazing. Well, I want to talk a little bit, just real quickly, on the Senate, because that's probably the big one that's most in play, and maybe the biggest question mark. Your sense is, because of Manchin and kind of the way the seats are being tossed about in 24, that Republicans are likely, or at least have a better chance of retaking the Senate. You want to walk through that a little bit?
Sure. So, I mean, 100-person Senate seats are basically staggered out. So you have a third up every 2 years. But this map is particularly favorable to Republicans. Of the 34 contests, I think only 11 are Republicans. If you look at the ratings, they're mostly safe to lean. In contrast, Democrats have to defend 23 seats, and they are very competitive, 3 of which are in states that Trump won. You already have Senator Joe Manchin announcing that he's not going to seek re-election in the Senate, I think because he recognized that he was going to lose. So the Senate's currently split 51-49. You get back to a 50-50 Senate, and there's really going to be pressure on 2 incumbent Democrat senators to hold their seats in states that Trump won. You have Sherrod Brown in Ohio and John Tester in Montana. And usually we just don't see that much ticket splitting in a presidential year. So if Trump wins both those states, which he should, because he won them in 2020 pretty handily, there's a good chance that, one if not both of them will go. And then in Arizona, you have a situation where we could have a competitive 3-party race. You have Senator Kirsten Sinema left the Democrat Party, is trying to run as an independent. You have Ruben Gallo, a congressman running from the Democrat side. There's a chance they could splinter the vote. And then you have the Republican gubernatorial candidate, Carrie Lake, very closely aligned with Donald Trump, who narrowly lost her gubernatorial bid in 2020, getting in there. So it could be a very interesting night. Now, why does that matter in terms of just beyond the, following the storylines and the like? What does it mean for investors? You're talking about now, if Biden wins and has a Republican Senate, you're going to have much more moderate administration appointees, because you're not going to be able to get anybody that's too progressive confirmed in a Republican Senate. I think at best, with respect to the configuration to deal with the debt limit, I'm sorry, cut this out, Harry. The other thing to consider too is Biden presidency with a Republican Senate may be the best political configuration in terms of dealing with the growing deficit concerns. Maybe actually doing what's sort of right now the unpalatable thing and dealing with entitlements, because at that point, Biden can't run for re-election anymore. You have Republicans there in the Senate, both can sort of share the blame. I'm not saying they're going to do that necessarily, but that's sort of what to watch there. And then if Trump wins, he's probably going to have a Republican Senate, and there's a chance he could carry Republicans into the House. I think Democrats probably have a more advantageous situation there in the House right now. But if Trump overperforms and carries some people across, then you have unified government. And the question there is going to be, what can Republicans do through budget reconciliation? And that's going back to the deficit concerns. Clearly, they're going to want to extend the Trump tax cuts moving forward. They're going to want to go beyond that. And sort of what's going to be the impact of addressing the situation. Can sort of grow the economy out of the deficit that Republicans claim, is just going to make the situation worse. So I think that's sort of why it matters.
And I mean, there was a lot of talk about a red wave in the last one. Is that at risk that Republicans are too excited that they think they're going to take these weak poll numbers, and actually it doesn't end up working out for them?
There's always a risk that they don't materialize. But again, I guess the one thing that I would draw a distinction between this time versus 22, again, it is a presidential election year, and you've had sort of a shift. Before, it used to be Republicans benefited in the smaller elections with respect to the midterms and off year. Now, with Trump at the top of the ticket, he brings out a lot of low propensity voters. So they're hoping that he'll be able to carry some of these people if he, in fact, is at the top of the ticket, because people that are coming out only to vote for him are, they're just going to vote straight party ballot. And then the other thing I think that Republicans are doing a better job this time, at least with respect to the Senate, is more coordinated candidate recruitment to try to avoid some of the messy primaries that they had in the midterms.
Well, we got another year of having to put up with this. So let's talk about the markets. Obviously, we're still in a strong seasonal tendency. And, I think it's interesting. One of the things that we did was look at, what happens when you kind of front load, or actually it's kind of mid load, if you will, the returns. In other words, you have a weak October and a decent start to the beginning of November. Do you really take away from those returns in the back half of seasonality. And there really isn't any evidence of that. In fact, it's just the opposite. If you have a weak third quarter and a weak first half of the fourth quarter, you actually tend to have a stronger second half to the fourth quarter. So we'll certainly watch for that. We are overbought. But again, it's teetering on a good overbought. We're not seeing the good overbought from an internal perspective. Some of the things that we look at, the percentage of issues above their 20-day moving average, percentage of issues making 20-day highs on the Russell 3000, those things have not triggered. So this is more of an external overbought condition. What's meant by that is that it's just a price index, and that can be driven by mega cap names, which clearly we're seeing, but that still tends to have more momentum characteristics than not. So I still think that we're in pretty good shape between now and the end of the year, and even into the first part of January. We will be watching for the micro caps not to be able to follow through. We will be watching for things like the MSCI World Index, the ACWI, as it's known colloquially in the profession, ex the US, if that starts to roll over. So some of these divergences are likely to peel off, or these indices are likely to peel off from these overbought conditions. That would be a sign that you're starting to lose some of that foundational support for overall equities. But I do think that this is yield dependent. I think that yields where they are today is fine. That's moved our yield impact model back down into the 40th percentile. That tends to be slightly more positive for the S&P than average. We're not down in the bottom 20th percentile, but still things tend to do fairly well in this zone. If yields are going to go back to 5%, we're going to be wrong. I think that's a pretty clear message that the dependency on yields is certainly important. We see it in the data, we see it in the valuations, we see it in a lot of different things. And once we move through this period of seasonality, the oversold conditions, some of the consternation that was out there from a sentiment perspective, I think that starts to change the dynamic if we get into that. So let's certainly focus on these yields. The real yields, really the spike that we saw in real yields continues to bode well for a compression in nominal yields. So I'm hopeful of that. But again, the trends of yields are positive, and so once we get oversold in yields, it will really be kind of this triangulation on whether or not this was really a more meaningful top in yields, or if it was just a correction in the ongoing trend. So it's something that we're absolutely going to have to watch. I think healthcare is actually set up pretty well for 2024, Steve. And I was going to ask you if there's anything on the legislative agenda for healthcare that might give them a boost, if things are so bad that maybe they're good there, because the returns, when we look at the returns for healthcare, and it's, we can get into the sub industries, would be biotech and life sciences and medical devices and equipment, et cetera. A lot of these things are kind of the knock-on effect, or the blowback boomerang from COVID, right? There was a lot of money thrown at these things and kind of created this bubble or boom scenario. And now as that goes by the wayside, a lot of these names are kind of fighting to keep their head above water. But it does look like, when we look at a long-term return perspective, I mean, these returns are about as bad as you've ever seen historically. Obamacare, Hillary care, whatever care that you're interested in, when these things got really, really beaten up, we're in a very similar, if not worse, zone when we were in some of those instances. And historically, they've produced good long-term bottoms, or at least the environment that can produce long-term bottoms. Is there anything from a legislative perspective that is favorable or disfavorable for healthcare that comes to mind?
Next year being a presidential election year, I guess what's good in the sense is gridlock. You're not going to move anything because lawmakers from both parties are just really risk averse. So from that standpoint, you take that legislative risk off the table. There's a potential that maybe towards some sort of year-end package that pharmacy benefit managers may get caught in the crosshairs. They're the drug middlemen that seem to attract some bipartisan disdain, people questioning their role in the value proposition there for pricing drugs. But again, we've been really struggling recently just to keep the lights on here in respect to the government. So I'm not optimistic at this point that anything's going to move there or anywhere else. So I guess no news is good news.
No news is good news, indeed. Well, speaking of no news, it's going to be a slow week. What's on the calendar for next week in Washington?
Lawmakers are supposed to return, and they're going to have a lot to deal with because they did what they typically do, which is punt on all the more difficult decisions. Spending fight is kicked into next year with the bifurcated dates, January 19th for, I think, 4 bills, and then February 2nd, Groundhog Day for the rest. But there's this question of the security supplemental still outstanding with the aid to Israel, Ukraine, Taiwan, and then what Republicans are demanding in exchange for Ukraine to address the situation there at the southern border. You're really not that many days left. I think there's 3 weeks until Congress is scheduled to adjourn again. And the fact that you've kicked the spending situation into next year sort of removes that forcing function. You're also going to have the Defense Authorization Act, something Congress has passed for 60 years. I think they want to do that again. And I think they're all interrelated because clearly Speaker Johnson can't really give too much there on that security supplemental side. So he may try to say, look, I'll give you a win here if you guys meet me somewhere where I can keep my job and keep the natives, settle down because they're getting restless on the future year spending. If not, we're probably looking at some sort of continuing resolution beyond February 2nd, and that might trigger some of the sequestration cuts. They're not as drastic as before. We're talking about 1% across the board. But for some of these Freedom Caucus members, they might say, look, at least we're guaranteed now some tangible cuts, as opposed to just sort of continuing the unified Democrat approach to spending that was passed in the last Congress. So.
Well, we'll continue to watch the momentum in this market. Obviously, we'd like to see a broadening out. We are continuing to see beta work in this anti-momentum trade work. That's good news. It's kind of the beginnings of something historically, but we usually take it back into, call it the return profile, about a 50th percentile. And I know that's getting very technical and wonky, but kind of getting back to average. And then once you get back to average, then that sort of dissipates. So we're not there yet. We're in about the 23rd percentile. So there's a little bit more to that anti-momentum trade, which is pretty typical for the seasonality trade as well. But upside resistance on the S&P really gets us back into those previous highs back from July, which is around 4,600. But again, the trends are back to positive, and I think that's good news, not bad news for the market overall. Join us again next week. We'll be 1 week older, 1 week wiser. Neil will be back. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter. And if you'd like deeper insight, follow us or go to RenMacAccess.com where you can join us there. Have a great Thanksgiving. Stay safe, be well, and we'll see you next week.